The wind across the Oklahoma Panhandle carried three things in abundance: grit, grief, and the secrets of the dead. For Pugan Vance, a widow isolated by tragedy and geography, it was a constant reminder of all she had lost. But on a blistering Tuesday in the summer of '88, it carried something new: the scent of blood. It was a smell that promised violence, a smell that clung to the air and warned of a choice that would either sign her death warrant or redefine the very meaning of honor on the unforgiving frontier. This isn't a story about cowboys and gunfights. It's about the brutal quiet in between, and how the deepest divides can be bridged by a single act of courage. The dust was a living thing. It coated Pugan Vance's tongue, settled in the lines around her eyes, and worked its way into the very grain of the pine-wood cabin she called home. It was the same dust she had shaken from her husband Thomas's clothes only a year ago, before the fever had stolen the breath from his lungs and left her in a world of suffocating silence. Her nearest neighbor, if you could call him that, was a 10-mile ride east. The town of Redemption was a full day's journey, a place she avoided with its prying eyes and whispered pity. Her world was the 160 acres of parched earth Thomas had claimed, a patch of defiant green surrounding a creek he'd called Whispering Creek, and the endless aching sky above. It was a lonely existence punctuated by the crow of her rooster and the lowing of her single milk cow, Bess. The scent hit her first. Coppery and thick, it cut through the smell of dry grass and sun-baked earth. It was the smell of a butchered hog, but there was no hog. Her eyes narrowed against the glare, scanned the line of cottonwoods that traced the creek bed at the edge of her property. That's where it came from. Her hand went instinctively to the worn grip of the Winchester rifle leaning against the porch rail. Thomas had taught her to shoot his large hands, steadying her own. "Out here, Ellie," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "A rifle isn't for hunting. It's for answering questions before they're asked." With the rifle held low, she moved. Not with the hesitant steps of a frightened woman, but with the measured, ground-eating stride of someone who understood the land and its dangers. The cottonwood leaves rustled a sound like hushed gossip. As she drew closer, another sound joined the whispers, a low, guttural moan of pain. There, half submerged in the shallow, muddy water of the creek, was a man. He was Cheyenne, that much was clear from the intricate beadwork on his buckskin leggings and the single eagle feather tied into his long black hair. His face, streaked with dirt and blood, was turned towards the bank. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his side, blooming like a fatal flower on the tanned leather. He was young, no older than 25, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, now slack with agony. Pugan froze. Every instinct, every story told in Redemption, every whispered warning from traveling peddlers screamed at her. Danger. Savage. Leave him. The Cheyenne and the settlers existed in a state of fragile, unspoken truce, a peace as thin as a sheet of ice over a raging river. A dead warrior on her land, regardless of the cause, was a spark in a tinderbox. They would come looking for him. They would find her. They would assume the worst. She could walk away. Let the creek and the sun do their work. By morning, he would be another secret the land kept. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But then he groaned again, a sound of such profound suffering that it bypassed her fear and struck a chord deep in her soul. It was the same sound Thomas had made in his final hours, a sound of a body fighting a battle it was destined to lose. In that moment, he wasn't a Cheyenne warrior, an omen of trouble. He was just a dying man. "Damn it all to hell." She breathed the words, tasting of dust and resignation. She waded into the creek, the cool water a shock against her sun-warmed skin. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. His eyes fluttered open as she dragged him onto the grassy bank. They were black, deep-set, and for a fleeting second they burned with a defiant full before clouding over with pain. "Easy now," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "Easy." Getting him to the cabin was a trial of strength and will. She half-dragged, half-carried him, his body, leaving a dark trail in the dust. Inside the cool dimness of the single room offered a small respite. She laid him on her own bed, the one she hadn't been able to share with Thomas's memory. The irony was a bitter pill. She stripped off his blood-soaked shirt, her movements clinical and efficient. The wound was a ragged tear in his side, a bullet hole. But it wasn't a clean shot. It looked like a low-caliber round from a pistol fired from a distance, a cowardly wound. It was festering the skin around it, angry and red. For the next day and a half, Poogan fought for his life. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, the only antiseptic she had. The man thrashed and yelled his words in a language she didn't understand, his hands gripping the quilt with white-knuckled intensity. She boiled willow bark for the fever and forced the bitter tea between his cracked lips. She sat through the long, hot nights, wiping his brow with a cool cloth, listening to his delirious ramblings. In his fever dreams, he spoke a name over and over. Nokomis, Nokomis. He also spoke another name with venom and fear, Cain. He had moments of clarity, brief, lucid windows where his dark eyes would focus on her. He never spoke to her in English, but his gaze held a universe of questions. "Who are you?" Why, once his hand weakly reached out, not to harm, but to touch, the simple wooden cross that hung on her wall, a relic of her own faith. His fingers traced its shape, a look of profound, weary understanding on his face. On the second morning, the fever broke. His breathing evened out, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Poogan, exhausted but hopeful, allowed herself a moment of relief. She washed the blood from the floorboards and made herself a thin grue, pushing a stray strand of sweat-damp hair from her face. Poogan felt a flicker of hope. She had done the impossible. She had stared into the face of frontier justice and chosen her own path. But the hope was short-lived. As the sun reached its zenith, a shudder ran through the warrior's body. A rattling cough shook his frame, and when he pulled his hand away from his mouth, it was stained with fresh, bright blood. The bullet had done more damage than she could see. It had torn something deep inside, something no willow bark, tea, or whiskey-cleaned bandage could mend. His eyes found hers, and this time they were completely clear. The pain was there, but so was acceptance. He knew. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He whispered one last word, a sound like the rustling of dry leaves. Vehoe. White woman. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact filled with a sorrow that transcended language. Then, with a final shuddering sigh, he was still. The silence that descended upon the cabin was heavier than any she had ever known. It was the silence of failure, the silence of a life extinguished under her own roof. For a long time she just sat there, the rifle across her lap, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of sunlight. She could not leave him in her bed. She could not dump his body in the wilderness. He was a man. He had fought for his life. He deserved more. He deserved a proper burial. Her jaw set in a hard line. If she was to be damned, she would be damned for an act of decency. She wrapped his body in her best quilt, the one her mother had made a kaleidoscope of colorful patches that seemed a flag of defiance against the monochrome landscape. Digging the grave was the hardest work she had ever done. The ground, baked hard by the relentless sun, fought her with every shovelful. Her hands blistered, her back screamed, and sweat blinded her. She dug for hours under the unforgiving eye of the afternoon sun, a lone figure carving a scar into the earth. She chose a spot on a small rise overlooking the creek where the morning sun would touch the ground first. When the hole was deep enough, she gently lowered the warrior into it. She stood for a moment, breathing heavily, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She was a woman of faith, but she knew no Cheyenne prayers. Her own felt inadequate alien to the man who lay before her. So she spoke from the heart, her words carried away by the wind. "I don't know your name," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know your people. But you were a man, and you died in my home. I did what I could. I hope you find peace." She hesitated, then added, "God have mercy on us both." With a grunt of effort, she began to fill the grave. Each thud of earth landing on the quilt was a drumbeat of finality. It was an act of burial, but it felt like an act of rebellion. She was a white woman, a widow burying a Cheyenne warrior on her land alone. It was a secret she and the dust would have to keep. When she was finished, she fashioned a simple mound of stones over the spot, not a cross, but something that felt more elemental, more fitting. Exhausted, emotionally and physically spent, she stumbled back to her cabin as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. She didn't know that from a ridge a mile to the west, a pair of eyes had watched her entire ordeal through a spyglass, a cruel smile playing on the watcher's lips. The next morning dawned with an oppressive stillness. The air was thick and hot, holding its breath. Poogan awoke, stiff and sore, the phantom weight of the shovel still in her hands. She moved through her morning chores in a fog, her thoughts circling the fresh mound of stones on the rise. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and take the shape of a man. The real hoofbeats came just after noon. It wasn't a sound she heard first, but one she felt, a low rhythmic vibration in the earth, a tremor that resonated in the pit of her stomach. It grew steadily from a hum to a rumble to the thunder of dozens of horses. She grabbed the Winchester and stood on her porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. They came from the north, cresting the same ridge where the warrior had likely come from. They were a vision of terrible majesty. At least 30 Cheyenne riders, their faces painted in stark lines of black and white colors of mourning and war. They moved not as a posse, but as a single fluid entity, their ponies churning up a cloud of dust that rose to meet the sun. They fanned out, forming a silent, menacing semicircle around her cabin, their ponies snorting and stamping in the sudden quiet. At their head sat a man who seemed carved from the very rock of the plains. He was older than the man she had buried, his face a mask of stern authority and profound grief. 2 eagle feathers, not one, adorned his hair. He carried a long, feather-decorated lance, and his eyes, black and piercing, locked onto hers. This was a chief. He said nothing. No one did. The silence stretched thick with accusation. Their gazes swept over her small homestead, taking in the single cow, the chicken coop, the worn porch. And then as one, their eyes settled on the rise on the fresh mound of stones overlooking the creek. The chief dismounted his movements, economical and powerful. Two other warriors, their expressions grim, did the same. They walked directly to the grave, their moccasins making no sound on the dry earth. Poogan's knuckles were white on the stock of her rifle. Her mouth was dry. This was it, the moment of reckoning. The chief knelt his hand, hovering over the stones. He picked one up, examined it, then looked at the earth, noting its freshness. He spoke to his companions in their native tongue, his voice a low, dangerous growl. One of the warriors pointed a finger directly at Poogan. The accusation was as clear as a gunshot. The chief, whose name was Black Buffalo, stood and turned to face her. He walked towards the porch with a deliberate, intimidating slowness. He stopped 10 feet away, his shadow falling over her. "The one who lies there," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. "He is my brother." Poogan's breath caught in her throat. "My brother." The words landed like stones. "His name was Kem." Black Buffalo continued, his voice devoid of emotion, a cold, flat plane of sound. "It means secret. He left our camp 2 suns ago. Now his spirit is silenced under this ground. Your ground." He took a step closer. "You are the Vehoi." The white woman. He said the word Keme had whispered, but where Keme's had held sorrow, his held contempt. "Did you silence him?" "No." Poogan said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I found him. In the creek. He was shot." A ripple of angry muttering went through the assembled warriors. Black Buffalo held up a hand, and silence fell once more. "Shot," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "With a white man's gun. You have such a gun." He nodded towards the Winchester in her hands. "I didn't shoot him," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "I tried to save him. He died in my home." A bitter, humorless smile touched Black Buffalo's lips. A likely story. A lone woman finds a Cheyenne warrior, takes him into her home to heal him, and then buries him with honor. The coyotes tell more believable tales. Suddenly, another voice cut through the tension, this one from the east, from the direction of the town of Redemption. "Well, now looks like the lady's got herself some unwelcome company." Poogan's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. Jedediah Kane. Kane rode up on a magnificent black stallion, a stark contrast to the Cheyenne ponies. He was a man who wore his prosperity like a weapon, a tailored coat, polished leather boots, and a silver-plated Colt peacemaker strapped to his hip. He was handsome in a predatory way, with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. He owned the biggest ranch in the county, and had been trying to buy Poogan's land for months, coveting her steady supply of water from Whispering Creek. Poogan had refused him every time. Behind him were 4 of his ranch hands, rough men with rifles cradled in their arms. They reined in, positioning themselves as a clear counterpoint to the Cheyenne. "Having some trouble here, Mrs. Vance?" Kane asked, his voice dripping with false concern. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were sizing up the Cheyenne, a flicker of something triumph in their depths. "This is my affair, Mr. Kane," Poogan said sharply. Black Buffalo's gaze shifted to Kane, his expression hardening. The 2 men looked at each other. Leaders of 2 different worlds, locked in a silent battle of wills over Poogan's small patch of dirt. "Your affair seems to involve the death of one of my people," Black Buffalo said, his voice low. Cain feigned surprise. "One of yours dead? Well, I'll be. Must have been some kind of accident." He looked at Poogan, a sly insinuation in his tone. Or maybe not. Things happen out here on the prairie. A man or a woman has a right to defend their property. He was framing her. The realization hit Poogan with the force of a physical blow. Cain was offering the Cheyenne a simple, believable narrative. The frightened white woman had killed their warrior. It would direct their wrath to her, and once she was gone, her land and her creek would be his for the taking. Black Buffalo turned his piercing gaze back to Poogan. The trap was set. On one side, a grieving war chief who believed she was a murderer. On the other, a greedy rancher who was happy to see her hang for a crime he likely committed. Her rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She was caught between the thunder and the snake, and the sky was about to break. The air was a powder keg, and Jedediah Cain had just struck a match. The Cheyenne warriors shifted their hands, tightening on their bows and rifles. Cain's men mirrored the action, their knuckles white. Poogan knew she had only seconds. "He was shot with a pistol," she said, her voice ringing out in the tense silence. "From a distance. A coward's shot, not with my rifle." Black Buffalo's eyes flickered with a sliver of something other than pure rage. It was the careful, analytical gaze of a leader, not just a bereaved brother. He looked from her simple, powerful Winchester to the ornate pistol on Cain's hip. "My brother was a warrior of the dog soldiers," Black Buffalo stated, his voice swelling with pride and pain. "He would not be brought down by a lone woman with a farm rifle unless he was shot in the back." "Show me." It was a command, not a request. "Show me the wound." Cain laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You ain't desecrating a grave on this Christian woman's land, Chief. Show some respect." The respect was shown when she buried him. Black Buffalo countered his gaze, fixed on Poogan. The words hung in the air. It was a small concession, a tiny crack in his wall of certainty. But it was there. "The disrespect was the bullet. I will see the bullet's story." He turned to two of his warriors and spoke in rapid Cheyenne. They nodded, handing their reins to another, and walked to the grave. With powerful, practiced movements, they began to carefully remove the stones, and then the earth, not with the franticness of ghouls, but with the reverence of an official duty. Cain sputtered, his face flushing with anger. "Now see here, you can't just—" "Be silent, Cain," Poogan snapped, turning to him. "This is not your land, and this is not your decision." She then looked at Black Buffalo. "Let him look. The truth is in the ground." Her defiance stunned both men into silence. Cain, because he was not used to being challenged, especially by a woman. Black Buffalo, because her certainty was a formidable thing. He gave a curt nod. The warriors worked quickly. Soon the corner of the colorful quilt was visible. They carefully brushed the dirt away and folded it back, exposing the body of Keme. In the harsh light of day, he looked smaller, more vulnerable. The warriors were gentle, moving their fallen brother as if he were merely sleeping. They turned him onto his back, exposing the crude, whiskey-cleaned bandage Poogan had applied. Black Buffalo knelt beside his brother's body. His face, which had been a mask of iron, softened for a heart-breaking moment. A deep guttural sound of grief escaped his lips. He gently touched his brother's cheek. Then his gaze hardened as he focused on the wound. With precise fingers, he peeled back Poogan's bandage. The wound was ugly, inflamed, and dark. Black Buffalo studied it for a long moment, his eyes missing nothing. He then spoke to his men, who began to gently probe the wound. It was a grim, difficult task. Poogan felt her stomach churn, but she didn't look away. Her fate was being decided in that bloody, torn flesh. After a few tense minutes, one of the warriors grunted and pulled something free. He held it up in his palm, dark with blood. It wasn't a mangled piece of lead from a rifle. It was a small, almost perfectly round ball from a low-caliber pistol. A Colt, perhaps. Black Buffalo took the bullet. He rolled it in his fingers, his expression unreadable. He then stood and walked not to Poogan, but to Jedediah Kane. He stopped directly in front of Kane's horse, forcing the big stallion to sidestep nervously. He held up the bullet. "My brother was tracked for a day." Black Buffalo said, his voice a low rumble. "The tracks show he was running wounded. They show another horse, a big horse with new iron shoes." He glanced meaningfully at the hooves of Kane's stallion. "This bullet is from a peacemaker's gun, the kind a rich man carries." Kane's face went pale under his tan. "That's ridiculous. Half the men in the territory carry a Colt." "But not half the men in the territory want this woman's land." Black Buffalo continued, his voice relentless. "Not half the men want the creek that never runs dry. My brother was not hunting. He was observing, watching the water, the lifeblood of the land. He saw something he should not have seen." The pieces clicked into place for Poogan with horrifying clarity. Kame hadn't been a threat. He had been scouting. Kane, ever paranoid about his assets, must have seen him near the creek, assumed the worst, or simply decided to eliminate a potential nuisance. The name Kame had whispered in his delirium, Kane. It wasn't a random word. It was an accusation. "He told me your name," Poogan said suddenly, her voice clear and strong. "Before he died, he said Kane." Every eye, Cheyenne and white, turned to her. Jedediah Kane's composure finally snapped. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the ugly greed beneath. "She's lying." The savage was delirious. "You'll believe this grieving widow and a dead Indian over me." He sneered, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his silver-plated pistol. "I came here to help this woman, and this is the thanks I get. You're all crazy." Black Buffalo's eyes were like chips of obsidian. "A man who speaks the truth does not need to shout. Kame had one more secret to tell." He turned back to the body and spoke in Cheyenne. One of the warriors nodded and gently opened Kame's clenched right hand. Pressed into his palm, caked with dried blood and dirt, was a small ornate silver concho, decorated with the distinct JK brand of Jedediah Kane's ranch. It must have been torn from Kane's saddle or coat during a fall or a brief, desperate struggle after he was shot. It was irrefutable proof. Kane saw it. The blood drained from his face. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, an excuse, a way out. He found none. He was cornered by the truth, a truth unearthed from the grave of the man he had murdered. His hand, which had been resting on his pistol, now gripped it. He was trespassing. Kane spat, his voice trembling with rage and fear. He got what he deserved. "The land does not know your name, Kane," Black Buffalo said softly, his voice carrying a chilling finality. "It only knows the blood you have spilled upon it. You have murdered my brother. You have tried to put your crime on an innocent woman. There is no honor in you." The world seemed to hold its breath. The Cheyenne warriors raised their weapons. Kane's men, seeing the raw, undeniable proof and the murderous look in their boss's eyes, began to back away, wanting no part of the bloodbath to come. Kane was alone, exposed and condemned, and a desperate man is the most dangerous man of all. Enough of this savage talk. Cain roared his fear, twisting into cornered animal rage. In one fluid, desperate motion, he drew his Colt peacemaker. He wasn't aiming at Black Buffalo. He was aiming at Poogan. If he was going down, he would take the cause of his downfall with him. It was a spiteful, cowardly act, the last move of a man who had lost everything. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Poogan saw the black hole of the pistol's muzzle, the flash of sunlight on the silver plating, the hate in Cain's eyes. She tried to raise the Winchester, but she was too slow. But Black Buffalo was not. With a speed that defied his size, he moved. He didn't charge or shout. He simply threw the lance he had been holding. It wasn't a long-distance arcing throw, but a short, powerful underhand thrust. The lance flew not end over end, but like a monstrous arrow, the feathers guiding it true. Cain's pistol fired the shot going wide, splintering the wood of the porch post next to Poogan's head. A split second later, the Cheyenne lance struck him square in the chest with a sickening thud. The force of the impact lifted him clean out of his saddle. He landed on the ground in a heap, the lance protruding from his tailored coat like a grotesque flagpole. His eyes were wide with shock, a final choked gasp escaping his lips before he lay still. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the frantic whinnying of Cain's riderless stallion. Cain's ranch hands, who had been hesitating, were now galvanized into action. Seeing their boss killed, they reacted with fear and ingrained prejudice. "They killed the boss, kill the Injuns!" one of them screamed, raising his rifle. The world exploded into chaos. Gunshots erupted, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of the Cheyenne's older firearms and the twang of bowstrings. Poogan, knocked back against the cabin wall by the force of Cain's missed shot, didn't hesitate. She wasn't fighting for the Cheyenne. She wasn't fighting against the whites. She was fighting for her home, for the truth she had unearthed. She dropped to one knee, levered around into the Winchester's chamber, and fired. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed for the shoulder of the man who had shouted, the one inciting the violence. Her shot was true. The man cried out and dropped his rifle, clutching his bleeding arm. Her action sent a shockwave through the battle. The Cheyenne, who had expected her to cower or side with the other whites, saw her fight. They saw her disable one of their attackers with an expert shot. Black Buffalo let out a great war cry, not just of fury, but of something else, vindication. He pointed at Poogan, then at the remaining ranch hands, a clear command in the gesture. "She is with us." An unlikely alliance was forged in the crucible of that dusty yard. Poogan used her porch for cover, her Winchester speaking with calm authority. She knew the angles of her land, the dips and rises that provided a moment's protection. The Cheyenne masters of skirmish warfare used their ponies for cover, darting in and out, loosing arrows and shots with deadly precision. One of Cain's men tried to take cover behind her water trough. Poogan fired into the wood just above his head, sending a spray of splinters and water into his face, forcing him back into the open, where a Cheyenne arrow quickly found its mark in his leg. It was over in less than a minute. It was not a battle. It was a rout. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and with their leader dead, the remaining two conscious ranch hands threw down their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. The silence that returned was more profound than before, filled with the smell of gunpowder and the groans of the wounded. The Cheyenne warriors quickly and efficiently disarmed the surrendered men, their expressions grim and businesslike. Poogan stood up slowly, the barrel of her Winchester still warm. Her ears were ringing. Her small yard was littered with wounded men and the body of Jedediah Cain. Her world had been turned upside down in the space of 2 days. Black Buffalo walked towards her, his face unreadable. He stopped in front of her, his gaze intense. He looked at the splintered porch post, where Cain's bullet had struck then at her unharmed. He looked at the ranch hand she had shot wounded, but alive. He then looked down at the body of his brother, which still lay peacefully by the desecrated grave. He bent down and retrieved his lance from Cain's body, wiping the blood on the dead man's own coat. He stood straight, the lance in his hand, a symbol of justice delivered. "You fight with the courage of a warrior." He said the words, a simple statement of fact. "You spoke the truth when lies would have been easier. You showed my brother honor when all you could expect in return was death." He looked at the grave, then back at her. "You took a great weight upon yourself, the weight of my brother's spirit. You carried it alone." Poogan could only nod, her throat too tight for words. "My people," Black Buffalo said, raising his voice for all his warriors to hear, "saw a white woman and assumed guilt. We were wrong. Our eyes were clouded by grief. This woman, Poogan Vance, she did not take Keme's life. She honored it. She is a woman of Ta Voha." The word was deep resonant. He saw the question in her eyes. "It means," he explained, his voice softening, "a woman of heavy heart, a woman who carries sorrow with strength, an honorable woman." He turned and issued a series of commands to his men. They began to tend to their own, but also to the wounded ranch hands, disarming them, binding their wounds and herding them together. 2 warriors began the somber task of reinterring Keme's body, this time with the proper rites, their low chanting filling the air. The immediate violence was over, but something far more powerful was about to begin. The Cheyenne were not leaving. They were preparing for a ceremony, one that would consecrate this blood-soaked ground and acknowledge the incredible world-altering event that had just occurred. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the yard, a transformation took place. The chaos of battle gave way to the solemnity of ritual. The captured ranch hands were bound and kept under guard, their groans a stark counterpoint to the rising mood of reverence. The body of Jedediah Cain was unceremoniously dragged away, his presence a stain that needed to be cleansed from the sight. Black Buffalo approached Poogan, who stood leaning against the porch rail, the Winchester resting beside her. She felt drained, an empty vessel, scoured clean by adrenaline and fear. "We will honor my brother now," he said, "and we will honor you." "I don't understand," she whispered. "You do not need to understand the words," he replied gently. "You need only to feel the truth of it. You acted to save a life, you honored the dead, and you fought for the truth. These are the actions of a chief, not a squaw. Tonight we do not dance for war or for harvest. We will dance the dance of the silent spirit. It is a dance of mourning and a dance of thanks for an unexpected act of grace." He invited her with a gesture to sit on the steps of her own porch, not as a prisoner, but as a guest of honor. She complied, sinking down onto the wood, her body trembling with exhaustion. As dusk settled, the Cheyenne built a fire in the center of the yard. Not a raging bonfire, but a low, respectful flame that cast a flickering golden light on the grim faces of the warriors. A single warrior began to beat a drum, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Thump, 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 thump. It was a sound as ancient as the plains. Another warrior, an old man, with a face like a dried apple, began to chant. His voice was not loud, but it carried a profound, sorrowful weight. It was a story, a eulogy set to music. Then the dancers began. They moved in a circle around the fire. They were the same men who had been ready to kill her hours before, but now their movements were filled with a different kind of intensity. It was not the dance of war, but a dance of grief. Their feet stomped the ground, not in anger, but in a gesture of waking the spirits of the earth. Their bodies swayed, telling the story of Keme's life. Pugin watched mesmerized. She saw them depict a hunt, their bodies mimicking the grace of a deer and the stealth of the hunter. She saw them show a battle, a flurry of controlled, powerful movements, a testament to his prowess as a dog soldier. Through their dance, they painted a portrait of the man she had never known, giving life and color to the dying stranger who had bled on her floor. Then the dance shifted. The rhythm of the drum slowed, and the chant became more somber. Black Buffalo stepped into the circle. He moved alone, his dance a raw, personal expression of loss. His powerful frame was racked with sorrow, his movement speaking of a bond broken, a brother lost. He was not a chief in that moment, but simply a man grieving under a canopy of stars. Tears streamed freely down his stoic face, illuminated by the firelight. And Pugin felt her own eyes well up in response. She was witnessing a grief so pure, so profound, it needed no translation. Finally, the dance changed one last time. The tempo of the drum picked up slightly, and the chant softened. One by one, the dancers turned their gaze to her. They did not approach her, but they angled their movements in her direction. Their hands, which had mimicked holding bows and spears, were now open palms turned upwards in a gesture of offering. They were telling the end of the story, the discovery, the care she had given, the burial. Their movements showed a figure offering water, tending a wound, and finally lifting a heavy weight. They were dancing her story. In that moment, the cultural gulf between them vanished. They were a people of story, and they were using their most sacred language to tell hers, to validate her actions, to absorb her act of honor into the narrative of their tribe. She, the White Widow, the Vehoi, was now a part of the story of Keme, forever entwined with his final journey. Black Buffalo ended his dance directly in front of her porch. The drum went silent. The chanting ceased. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. He stood before her, his chest heaving. What one person does an entire people can feel, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Today we felt honor from a place we did not expect. You have a new name among my people. You are Wihawaste. Good woman. We will not forget this. He turned and walked back to his warriors. The ceremony was over. As the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky, the Cheyenne prepared to leave. They gathered their wounded, retrieved their horses, and mounted up. Black Buffalo reined his pony in before her porch one last time. The men you wounded will live, he said. We will take them to the soldiers at Fort Supply. We will tell them what Cain has done. The truth will be known. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her small, battered farm. This land is now protected by the memory of my brother and by the respect of my people. You will be safe here, good woman. With a final solemn nod, he turned his horse and led his warriors away, their forms melting back into the vast plains from which they had come. They left behind a yard scarred by violence, a dead fire, and the lingering echo of a sacred drum. Pugin Vance stood alone on her porch, the rising sun warming her face. She was still a widow, still isolated. But she was no longer just a settler. She was Wihawaste, A woman who had buried a fallen warrior, and in doing so had forged a fragile, unbelievable peace, not with treaties or laws, but with a simple, profound act of shared humanity. The dust still coated everything, but for the first time in a long time, it felt less like a shroud and more like the soil of home. The silence left behind by the Cheyenne was heavier than the one Pougan had known before. Her previous solitude had been a hollow vessel defined by the absence of her husband. This new silence was resonant, filled with the echoes of a drumbeat, a guttural chant, and the ghost of a name whispered on the wind, Wihawaste. The first task was the most grim. Jedediah Kane's body still lay where he had fallen, a testament to his greed. His fine coat was ruined. His cold eyes stared sightlessly at the vast, indifferent sky. The Cheyenne had left him his punishment complete in their eyes, but his presence was a poison on her land. With a weariness that went bone deep, Pugin hitched her old mule to a makeshift sled. Burying one man had been an act of honor. Burying the second was a sanitation. She did not wrap him in a quilt. She did not choose a spot where the sun would touch first. She dragged his body to the far edge of her property, to a rocky patch of ground where nothing grew, and gave him a shallow, unmarked grave. It was all the ceremony he deserved. Her next trip was to redemption. She knew she couldn't avoid it forever. She needed flour and salt, and she needed to face the world that she had, however unintentionally, turned on its head. As she rode her mare down the town's dusty main street, a hush fell over the boardwalk. Men stopped whittling conversations, ceased in the saloon, and curtains twitched in windows. They were not the pitying looks she had received as a widow. These were stares of awe, fear, and morbid curiosity. The town sheriff, a paunchy, world-weary man named Bartholomew Cobb, met her outside the general store. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect she had never received from him before. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice low. We heard what happened. The army patrol from Fort Supply came through. They got the whole story from the chief. Black Buffalo." He said the name carefully as if it were a foreign delicacy. "And from Kane's men. Their stories matched." "Then you know I didn't seek any trouble." Pugin said, her voice even. "Seems to me the trouble sought you." Cobb corrected his eyes, glancing at her Winchester, which now seemed a permanent extension of her arm. "The circuit judge will call it self-defense. Justified, all of it. Kane was a grasping fool, and he finally grasped too far." He paused, looking at her with a new understanding. "Folks round here won't be bothering you anymore, ma'am. I reckon they're more scared of you than any Indian tribe now." He was right. The storekeeper, Mr. Abernathy, who had once been condescending, now tripped over himself to fetch her supplies, refusing to take her money for the first bag of flour. "On the house, Mrs. Vance, for your trouble." She had become a legend, a frontier folk tale, brought to life, the lone widow who befriended the Cheyenne and brought down the most powerful rancher in the county. They didn't understand the nuance, the honor, or the grief. They only understood the result. She was no longer just Pougan Vance. She was the woman from Whispering Creek, a woman to be left alone. As autumn painted the cottonwoods in hues of gold and amber, Pugin found a new rhythm. The silence of her cabin was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. She would often walk to the rise, where Kime lay buried. The mound of stones was a landmark, a focal point for her new life. It was a reminder not of death, but of a connection that had redefined her existence. One crisp morning as the first frost silvered the ground, she found it, Lying just outside her cabin door was a magnificent, freshly killed buck. There were no tracks leading to or from the spot, save for her own. It was a silent gift, a message delivered by a ghost. Black Buffalo's promise fulfilled. You will be safe here. From then on, the gifts would appear sporadically. A brace of rabbits in the dead of winter, a bundle of dried herbs known to ward off fever left on a fence post. She never saw who left them. She never had to. She was being watched over not as a subject, but as a respected neighbor. The Cheyenne kept their distance, honoring her solitude, but their presence was a subtle protective blanket thrown over her small piece of the world. Pugin Vance lived out her days on that land. She never remarried. She never left. She became a fixture of the plains, as much a part of the landscape as the creek and the cottonwoods. Travelers would sometimes see her a lone figure, moving with quiet purpose, her silver hair catching the prairie wind. They would say she had an aura of peace about her, a strength that was both formidable and serene. She was a woman who had stood between two worlds, and through an act of simple decency had found her own. She was Wihawaste, the good woman, and on the quiet nights when the wind blew just right from the north, it seemed to carry the faint, distant echo of a drum, a heartbeat of honor that would forever be tied to her land and her name. 15 years passed. The West, once a vast and untamed canvas, was being relentlessly sketched over with new lines. Fences now carved up the open plains the railroad had sliced through the territories like a steel knife, and the great herds of buffalo were little more than a memory. The town of Redemption had grown its dusty street, now boasting a brick bank and 2 churches. The era of silent truces and frontier justice was fading into the sepia tones of history. Pugin Vance was now an old woman. The lines of grief that had once bracketed her eyes had softened into a web of wisdom. Her hair, once the color of corn silk, was now a braid of pure silver. She moved more slowly. Her body bent slightly from decades of hard work, but her eyes were as clear and steady as ever. She was a landmark, a living piece of the bygone era, known to all as the Widow of the Creek. The gifts of game had long since stopped as the Cheyenne had been moved onto the reservation miles to the north, their world shrinking as the settlers' world expanded. The quiet protection she had once felt had been replaced by the simple, enduring peace of her land. One bright autumn afternoon, as she was tending to the last of her tomato plants, a visitor arrived. He was a young Cheyenne man, no more than 20, riding a lean pinto pony. He was not dressed for war or hunting, but in clean, simple buckskins, his long hair held back by a leather band. He dismounted at the edge of her property, the same place where Black Buffalo's warriors had once fanned out in a menacing line. But this young man did not radiate menace. He carried an aura of profound respect. He waited patiently for her to acknowledge him. Pugin straightened up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She felt no fear, only a deep and resonant curiosity. "Can I help you?" she called out. Her voice thinned by age, but still clear. The young man approached, leading his horse. He stopped a respectful 10 feet from her. "Are you the one they call Wihawaste?" he asked, his English perfect learned in the reservation school. Pugin's heart gave a little flutter. It had been years since she had heard that name spoken aloud. "I am," she said simply. "My name is Little Hawk," he said. "My father was a warrior named Red Clay. He rode with Chief Black Buffalo on the day they came to this place." He looked around, his gaze taking in the quiet cabin, The neat garden and the peaceful rise where Cain's grave lay, now covered in wild prairie grass. I have grown up with your story. It is told by the fire in winter. It is told to the children when they are learning about the world. Poogan felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She had lived her quiet, solitary life, never knowing the true reach of her actions that fateful day. It is the story of the good woman. Little Hawk continued, his dark eyes earnest. It teaches us that honor is not defined by the color of skin or the language one speaks. It teaches us that a single act of courage can be a light that shines across generations. It teaches us to look for the human heart, even in an enemy. He paused. I am on my journey to become a man. Before I seek my vision, my elders told me I should come here, to see the place where a great honor was both given and received. Tears welled in Poogan's eyes, and she did not bother to wipe them away. I was just a woman, she whispered, her voice thick. I did what any decent person should have done. Decency was a rare medicine in those days, Little Hawk said softly. You were brave enough to use it. From a pouch at his side, he took out a small, beautifully beaded object. It was a turtle, a powerful symbol of longevity, wisdom, and the earth itself in Cheyenne culture. The beadwork was intricate, a mosaic of blue, white, and red. This is for you, from my mother and all the mothers of our tribe, so you know that your story lives with us. He held it out to her. Poogan took the turtle its weight, feeling both small and immense in her palm. The legacy of her life held in her hand. She looked at the young hopeful face before her, and then towards the creek, still whispering its secrets after all these years. Wait here, she said. She went into her cabin and returned with her oldest tin cup. She walked past Little Hawk down the gentle slope to Whispering Creek, the source of all the trouble and all the resolution. She dipped the cup into the cool, clear water and brought it back to him. This is all I have to offer in return, she said, holding out the cup. Water from the land that connects our stories. Little Hawk took the cup with both hands, as if receiving a sacred object. He drank deeply, his eyes never leaving hers. When he was finished, he handed the cup back. Woo Pilla, he said. Thank you. He gave a solemn nod, then turned, mounted his pony, and rode away, not looking back. Poogan stood in her garden, the beaded turtle in one hand and the tin cup in the other, and watched until he was a tiny speck on the horizon. She was alone again in the quiet of her homestead. But she was not lonely. She was the keeper of a creek, the guardian of a grave, and the beginning of a story that was now being told by the children of her former enemies. Her simple act of burying a fallen warrior had not just brought peace. It had planted a tree of understanding whose branches now stretched far beyond her own small life, offering shade and wisdom for generations she would never meet. The sun began to set, casting a golden light on the rise, and Poogan Vance Wihawaste smiled. Her legacy was safe. The story of Poogan Vance and Black Buffalo isn't one you'll find in history books. It's a testament to the fact that the most profound moments in history aren't always grand battles, but quiet personal choices. It's about the courage to see a human being instead of a label, and the honor that can bloom in the most desolate of landscapes. Poogan's decision to help a dying man, an enemy by all accounts, set in motion a chain of events that exposed a villain, prevented a massacre, and built a bridge between two worlds founded on mutual respect. Her story reminds us that our shared humanity is a language more powerful than any spoken tongue, and true strength is often found in the quiet resolve of a heavy heart. If this story of courage and unexpected honor resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like to help it reach others. Share it with someone who appreciates tales that dig into the heart of the human spirit. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the dramas and legends of the Wild West and beyond. Thank you for listening.